The silence in our house had become a companion. Not a welcome one, but a familiar presence that had settled in after my wife, Sarah, passed away. It was a heavy, woolen kind of quiet, especially in the evenings. My son, Leo, was 18 now, a freshman at the local community college, and the vibrant, noisy boy he'd once been seemed like a story I'd read about someone else's child. He spent most of his time in his room, the faint blue glow of his computer screen the only sign of life from under his door. We talked, of course, about bills, about classes, about what to have for dinner, but it was all surface. The deep, underwater currents of his heart were a mystery to me. 10 years. It's a long time, and yet, it can feel like a single, drawn-out breath. A decade ago, our home was a hub of chaos and laughter. The epicenter of that chaos was often a little boy named Noah. Noah and Leo were inseparable from the age of 6. They were a classic pair. Leo, the thoughtful, slightly cautious planner, and Noah, a human whirlwind of freckles, scraped knees, and irrepressible ideas. Our backyard was their kingdom. They built elaborate forts out of old sheets and dining chairs, staged intergalactic wars with sticks for blasters, and spent entire afternoons digging in the dirt, convinced they were mere inches from discovering buried pirate treasure. Sarah would watch them from the kitchen window, a smile on her face as she prepared their endless stream of peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. Noah called her Aunt Sarah, and his presence was so constant that it felt like we had a second son. The change started subtly in middle school. The interests shifted from backyard adventures to video games and skateboards. But the bond was still there. Then, Sarah got sick. The diagnosis was brutal, the decline swift. During that terrible year, Noah was still around, a quiet, supportive shadow. He'd come over and just sit with Leo, sometimes not saying a word, the two of them playing video games for hours, the controller clicks and game soundtracks a feeble defense against the fear that filled the house. After the funeral, everything changed. The grief was a physical thing, a thick fog that separated Leo from the rest of the world. He withdrew. And Noah stopped coming over. At first, I thought it was just a temporary thing. Teenagers are fickle, I told myself. But weeks turned into months. I'd ask Leo, how's Noah? Is he coming over? And I'd get a shrug and a non-committal, he's busy, or, I don't know. I'll admit, I felt a quiet resentment build in my chest. How could he abandon Leo like that? At his lowest point, I saw the hurt in my son's eyes, a fresh layer of pain on top of the monumental loss of his mother. The friendship, a 10-year institution, had simply vanished. It felt like a death of its own kind. As the years passed, Leo built new, quieter friendships. He did well in school, he was a good kid, but the light that had once been there, the one that Noah had so often fanned into a blaze, was dim. We moved through life, a father and son orbiting each other in a shared atmosphere of loss. We never talked about Noah. He became a ghost, a relic from a happier, sun-drenched past that was too painful to revisit. Then, one utterly ordinary Tuesday evening, the trajectory of our lives changed forever. Leo was at a study group. I was in the living room, half watching a baseball game, half dozing in my armchair. The doorbell rang, a sharp, intrusive sound in the quiet house. I frowned, checking my watch. It was past 8, not a time for solicitors. I heaved myself out of the chair and walked to the door, peering through the peephole. The porch light illuminated a young man I didn't recognize. He was tall and lanky, with a nervous energy that was evident even through the distorted fisheye lens. He had a backpack slung over one shoulder and was shifting his weight from foot to foot. I opened the door, the cool night air washing over me. "Can I help you?" The young man's eyes, a familiar shade of hazel I couldn't quite place, met mine. He looked pale, anxious. "Mr. Evans," he said, his voice deeper than I expected, but with a tremor in it. "Yes." He swallowed hard. "It's me, Noah Miller." The name hit me with the force of a physical blow. I literally took a step back. Noah, the little boy with the gap-toothed smile and grass-stained knees. The ghost from our past, now standing 6 feet tall on my front porch a decade later. My mind scrambled, trying to reconcile the man in front of me with the child I remembered. The freckles were still there, dusted across his nose, but his face was longer, more defined. The unruly mop of hair was now neatly styled. But the eyes were the same. "Noah," I finally managed, my voice thick with disbelief. "My God, what are you doing here?" I need to talk to you," he said, his gaze dropping to his shoes for a moment before returning to mine, pleading. "And Leo, is he here?" He's at a study group, I said automatically. A part of me, the protective father, wanted to shut the door. This boy, this man, had hurt my son. He'd disappeared when Leo needed him most. What right did he have to show up now, after 10 years, and disrupt the fragile peace we'd built? But the raw, undisguised anguish in his eyes stopped me. This wasn't a social call. You'd better come in, I said, my voice softer than I'd intended. He stepped inside, and the surreal feeling intensified. He was standing in our foyer, a place he'd run through 1,000 times as a child, but he was a stranger. He looked around, and I saw a flicker of recognition and pain in his expression. The house hadn't changed much. Can I get you something? Water? I asked, leading him into the living room. No, I'm okay, thank you, sir, he said, sitting stiffly on the edge of the sofa. I took my armchair, the baseball game forgotten, muttering on the TV. An awkward silence descended. I just looked at him, waiting. He took a deep, shaky breath. Mr. Evans, first of all, I am so sorry. For everything. For just vanishing. The apology was direct, and it disarmed me. It was a long time ago, Noah. Not long enough, he said, his voice tight. There's a reason. A reason I left, and it's not what you or Leo probably think. I wasn't just being a bad friend. I was a coward. He looked down at his hands, clenched tightly in his lap. After Aunt Sarah, after she died, things at my house got really bad. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. What do you mean? My dad, Noah began, then stopped, swallowing convulsively. He'd always been strict. But after Sarah passed away, something in him snapped. He became different, angry all the time. He started drinking more, and the things he'd say. He looked up at me, and for the first time, I saw the shadow of the scared little boy underneath the young man's face. He started saying the most horrible things. He said that your family was cursed. That grief was a sickness and we couldn't get too close or it would infect us too. He forbade me from coming over here. He said if he ever caught me with Leo, he'd make things very difficult for me at home. My blood ran cold. I remembered Noah's father, Mark Miller. A quiet, reserved man I'd never known well. He'd always seemed a bit stern, but I'd never have guessed. He said that Leo was a lost cause, Noah continued, his voice barely a whisper now. That he was drowning and he'd pull me down with him. He told me to find new friends, healthy friends. And I was 13, I was terrified of him. So, I obeyed. I stopped calling. I stopped coming over. I'd see Leo at school and I'd look the other way because I was so ashamed. Ashamed that I was abandoning him, and ashamed that I was too weak to stand up to my father. The pieces were clicking into place with a devastating clarity. All these years, I'd thought it was simple teenage fickleness, a friendship naturally running its course. I'd never imagined this prison of fear and control that Noah had been living in. Why didn't you tell someone? I asked, my voice hoarse. A teacher, me, and say what? Noah said, a bitter edge to his voice. My dad's mean. He didn't hit me, Mr. Evans. Not then. It was all psychological. The threats, the constant put-downs, the control. Who would believe me? And I was scared of what he'd do if I told. So I just disappeared. I thought I was protecting myself, and in some twisted way, I think I even believed I was protecting Leo from my dad's wrath by staying away. He looked at me, his eyes swimming with unshed tears. But it was the worst mistake of my life. Leaving him alone like that. I have carried the guilt of that every single day for 10 years. It's been a weight on my chest that never goes away. The resentment I'd held onto for so long began to crumble, replaced by a profound and aching pity. This wasn't a story of a bad friend. It was a story of a scared child trapped in an impossible situation. What happened now, Noah? I asked gently. Why are you here tonight? My dad died, he said flatly. 3 weeks ago. Heart attack. Oh, Noah, I'm sorry. He shook his head. Don't be. It's complicated. His death, it was like the door to a prison cell swinging open. The first thing I thought, the very first thing, wasn't about his estate or the funeral or anything. It was that I could finally come here. I had to come here. I had to try and explain. I know I don't deserve Leo's forgiveness. I don't deserve yours. But I had to tell you the truth. I couldn't go to my own grave with you both thinking I was just some fair-weather friend who ditched Leo when things got hard. Just then, we heard the key turn in the front door. My heart leapt into my throat. Leo walked in, dropping his backpack by the door, looking tired. Hey, Dad, whose car is that out? he began, rounding the corner into the living room. His eyes landed on Noah, and he froze. The color drained from his face. For a long, suspended moment, the two young men just stared at each other. The air in the room became charged, thick with a decade of unspoken words and unresolved hurt. Noah. Leo's voice was a disbelieving whisper. Noah stood up slowly, his hands held slightly away from his body, a gesture of surrender. Hey, Leo, what are you doing here? Leo's tone was flat, guarded. The warmth I sometimes saw in him was gone, replaced by a defensive wall I hadn't seen since the worst days of his grief. I asked him the same thing, I said quietly. Leo, you need to sit down and listen to what Noah has to say. Leo's eyes flickered to me, a question in them, but he obeyed, sinking into the armchair opposite me, his body language closed off, his arms crossed over his chest. He kept his gaze fixed on Noah, a hard, unyielding stare. Well, Leo said. Noah took another deep breath and began again. He told Leo everything, just as he'd told me. About his father's descent, the cruel words, the threats, the forbidden friendship. He didn't sugarcoat his own fear, his own cowardice. He laid it all bare, his voice cracking with emotion as he spoke to Leo directly. I am so sorry, Leo, he finished, his voice raw. I was a terrible friend. You lost your mom, and instead of being there for you, I made you lose your best friend, too. I have thought about that every day. I've wanted to call you 1,000 times. I'd drive past your house sometimes, just to see if you were okay. But I was still scared. I was a prisoner of my own fear until 3 weeks ago. I know it's too late. I know we can't go back. But I couldn't live with you not knowing why. Leo had listened in stony silence. His face was an unreadable mask. When Noah finished, the only sound was the faint commentary from the baseball game. I held my breath, my heart aching for both of them, for the boy who had suffered in silence, and for the man who had carried his guilt for a decade. Finally, Leo uncrossed his arms. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and looked down at the floor. When he spoke, his voice was low and thick. All these years, he began slowly, I thought you just didn't care anymore. I thought I'd done something wrong. I thought I was so wrapped up in my own grief that I'd driven you away. I replayed every conversation we'd ever had, looking for a clue. He looked up at Noah, and the mask was gone. In its place was a vulnerability I hadn't seen in him since he was a child. It never occurred to me that you were going through hell, too. That you were being forced to choose. It wasn't a choice, Leo, Noah said, his voice desperate. It was an ultimatum, and I chose wrong. I chose fear over friendship. You were a kid, Leo said, and the simple truth of that statement seemed to hang in the air. A scared kid with a tyrant for a father. He let out a long, slow breath, as if exhaling the weight of a decade. My dad always says that context is everything. I get it now. He stood up. Noah watched him, looking like a man awaiting a verdict. Leo took a few steps toward him. I spent a long time being angry at you, Leo said. But honestly, that anger burned out years ago. What was left was just a hole. A question mark. And now it has an answer. He stopped in front of Noah. I forgive you, Noah. The words were simple, but their effect was seismic. Noah's composure shattered. A sob escaped him, and he brought his hands up to his face, his shoulders shaking. Leo didn't hug him. The moment was too raw, too new for that, but he placed a hand firmly on Noah's shoulder. It's okay, man, Leo said, his own eyes glistening. It's okay. I watched from my chair, tears streaming freely down my own face, unashamed. This was a healing I hadn't even known we needed. The ghost that had haunted our house for 10 years was finally being laid to rest, not with anger, but with understanding and grace. That was the beginning. The story didn't end with that one emotional night on the porch. What happened next was a slow, careful rebuilding. Noah started coming over again. Not every day, but once a week, then twice. The first few visits were awkward, filled with long silences and careful conversation. They started by catching up on the superficial stuff, music, movies, college life. It was like they were two strangers trying to find common ground. But then, one afternoon, I heard laughter from the backyard. Real, genuine laughter. I looked out the window and saw them standing by the old oak tree, the site of their childhood fort. They were pointing and talking, their body language more relaxed. They were starting to excavate their shared history, not as a source of pain, but as a foundation. They began hanging out properly. They went to see a movie. They played video games in Leo's room, the sounds of their competitive banter a music I hadn't realized I'd missed so desperately. It wasn't the same as it was when they were kids, of course. They were different people now. Leo was more reserved, Noah carried a quiet gravity he'd earned through his difficult childhood. But a new friendship was growing, stronger and more conscious for having been forged in the fires of loss and reconciliation. Noah opened up to us about his life. He was living in his father's old house, trying to decide whether to sell it. He was going to therapy to untangle the knots of his upbringing. He had no other family to speak of, and it became clear that in coming back to us, he wasn't just seeking forgiveness, he was seeking a family. One evening, about 2 months after his first unexpected visit, the three of us were in the kitchen after dinner, washing dishes. The setting sun was streaming through the window, painting the room in warm, golden light. Leo was drying a plate, Noah was putting away the glasses, and I was scrubbing a pot. It was a simple, domestic scene, but it felt monumental. It felt like wholeness. Noah looked at me, then at Leo. "You know," he said, his voice soft but clear, "for the last 10 years, I felt like I was living in a black and white movie. Since I've been coming back here, it's like someone turned the color on." Leo smiled, a real, easy smile that reached his eyes. "Yeah," he said, "I know what you mean." I looked at these two young men, my son, and the boy who was once again becoming like a son to me, and I felt a peace I hadn't felt in a decade. The unexpected return wasn't just about revisiting the past, it was about redeeming it. The lost years couldn't be reclaimed, but they could be given meaning. They were a painful lesson in the damage of secrets and the transformative power of truth. After 10 years, the ghost was gone. In its place was a living, breathing second chance. And in the warm, noisy silence of our kitchen, filled with the simple sounds of family, I knew that sometimes the most unexpected endings are really the most beautiful beginnings.